Okay, I think we're ready to begin our last session of the day, so that we can finish in about 1 hour. So please take your seats. I really appreciate very much your staying after lunch. It's usually nap time. But this is an interesting subject, or an interesting intersection between two important subjects, the rule of law and what Mexico is trying to do, which is push ahead with energy reform. There's one more panel left, and that includes my colleague, Dr. Pablo de la Peña, is the moderator from the Tec de Monterrey, Dr. Guadalupe Correa-Cabrera, with whom I co-authored the paper on security and energy reform, and Miguel González Compeán, welcome as well, and finally Pilar Rodriguez from the Universidad Autónoma de Nuevo León as well. So thank you very much, and Pablo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tony, very much. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate the invitation to be part of this effort, extraordinary effort, and I think extraordinary results in trying to analyze and make some reflections about this energy reform in Mexico. Well, as the previous panels, we're going to develop 10 minutes each one of the panelists, and then we will have some time for Q&As. So if you will, we can start with Lupita Correa, in co-author with Tony. The topic of this essay is security role and law and Mexico's energy reform, followed by Miguel González Compeán, and a co-author with Marco Antonio Michel Diaz, and at the end of this panel, we will have Pilar Rodriguez Ibáñez. Thank you very much, Lupita.
Thank you. Well, thank you for being here, and we will. I'm going to try to describe very briefly what this article is about, but I'm going to focus on the theme of security. Tony and myself were going to write on security, but then security and the rule of law, of course. But then we realized that we had to define what the rule of law is, because everybody's talking about the absence of rule of law, but not, conceptualize it. And then doing some research about this, we entered the website of the World Justice Project, and we tried to revise the index, and we thought it was very interesting and comprehensive. It's the most comprehensive measure we would have to really let us know where we are located with regards to that. In an earlier panel, there was and of course in the keynote presentation, there was optimism about what was going to happen in Mexico after the passage of energy reform. There was a lot of optimism when the law was passed and the secondary legislation was passed in 2014. However, today I'm not as optimistic as I was, and this has to do with the situation that we had lived for probably 10 years until today, which has to do with a very important security crisis and a crisis with regards to the rule of law, and that might. Of course, we were talking about the fact that many of the big energy companies can operate in every space and every part of the world, even the most dangerous ones. However, energy reform in Mexico was not modified for just a couple of people or a couple of businesses. It's about development. It's about development of Mexico, of Mexicans, the region, and to improve the relationships between the nations. But it's about development and it's about the people. But what is happening then? We really need to find a way to strengthen our rule of law, to strengthen our institutions. In return, the legislation, energy reform legislation, and the secondary legislation seem very well, thought and very very appropriate for the current framework. However, as we mentioned, we have many institutional problems, and when we try to define, when we try to, to establish the different elements and the different dimensions of the rule of law, based a lot on what the World Justice Project had come up with, which was very, very comprehensive, we realized that the main issues that we're facing now that would challenge and will challenge our appropriate passage and the appropriate ways of implementing the reform are three. We have three main challenges, and I'm going to talk and I'm going to focus on security, but the three of them are based and are very challenged by the fact that we have extremely high levels of corruption that are deteriorating. And when we saw, we had seen this, the 2014, now the 2015 indicators are showing a deterioration in some of the dimensions that the World Justice Project is pointing out. And it's not news for us that 43 students were killed in Ayotzinapa. Very recently, the most wanted man in Mexico was allowed to escape a prison of maximum security for the second time, and now he was arrested again, and that was considered as a big success. I would not consider that as a big success, but as a big failure of the prison system, which is how you punish a crime. I mean, punishment and the last step of the justice system, which is the prison system, doesn't work in Mexico. Just today, 52 prisoners in Topo Chico in the state of Nuevo León were assassinated within the prison, and there's not enough information of how this happened. What we're seeing in Mexico is something that really it's not probably not for BP, Shell, and all these companies, but for Mexicans, in general, this is very very complicated. The security situation in Mexico was not going to be resolved if we don't resolve the corruption problem, the corruption issues that we have, and this is the fundamental piece that we have to consider. The third one, we talked a little bit about this, which is like the possibility that we're going to face some big social problems when the legislation, when the reform and all the companies come, and issues regarding the land and the water. Because even though there in the legislation, if you read the secondary legislation with regards to land, we don't know how is this going to be with regards to water. But with regards to land, companies shouldn't have any problem, because if after 180 days and 3 months, things are not decided, and since energy development is of national interest, the people have to arrive to a negotiation with the companies, and they had to rent or sell or whatever their lands. What we sometimes don't think about is like the importance of the land for the Mexican people. We arrived to a revolution. I mean, there was a revolution in Mexico, and one of the main points was, the access to land. So we don't know if in the implementation of the reform, with these investments, there will be some social problems related to land and related to water. There's a challenge there. We don't know if this is going to have an impact and what the dimension of the problem will be, if there will be. Mexicans, according to some groups, are not as they will not protest. Probably they're not, so they will not get together. But we don't know if we're talking about land and water. So we have to wait. And we also wrote about the amparo and the possibility that with the amparo, there was an amparo that was already running. AMSA, the Altos Hornos in Mexico, last year was successful with an amparo about their land. So this was the first attempt against the implementation of the reform with regards to land. So, but regards to security, as we know, is one of our weakest and the weakest of these things in Mexico. We had an allegedly a war on drugs, and well, that's an unconventional security policy in Mexico that involved the armed forces and the federal police in public security, in matters of public security, because of the corruption that was inside the state and local police and law enforcement agencies in Mexico. The problem was enormous, and the problem is still very important. The biggest groups were fragmented because there was a direct action against them, and now we're seeing other groups that are not necessarily related to drug trafficking, but we're observing the fragmentation of these big organizations, and we are observing a change with regards to the type of crimes that are being done, and the situation in Mexico is still very complicated, but now we have more groups, fragmented groups, but still very powerful. 3 years ago, we were talking about the Zetas. 4 years and 5 years ago, now we're talking about El Cártel Jalisco Nueva Generación, Los Rojos, Los Guerreros Unidos, and we're observing that the conflicts are moving, in different parts of the nation. And why is this not? Why this has not been solved? Because of corruption at the highest levels. It's impossible to see that many of the governors or former governors of Mexico are allegedly, have been allegedly linked to groups like that, to groups like the Zetas. The former governor and the current governor of Veracruz, the former governor of Coahuila. We just saw that he was arrested in Spain, and there were alleged connections with criminal organizations. But we really don't know. It's what is happening in the country has even touched the executive and the president of Mexico, and this is not going to help in any form to solve any of these challenges and any of the problems. And what are we going to do with this? And that was important. The last question and the last presentation about other changes in the legislation regarding probably the observation of an international organization, because otherwise, if the executive power is so questioned today, how from there we're going to be able to solve the situation if on the top things are like this. So basically, to solve the situation of security, to assure that the land issues and the investments take place in an appropriate way, we need to solve the main issues that have to do with corruption. So I'm not very optimistic as of today. I don't see. The political reform, the arrival to the scene of independent candidates will not really work if we don't have the mechanisms to punish and to we don't resolve these institutional problems. And for example, the prison system issue is very important. So.
Thank you very much, Lupita. Thank you. Now we are going to move with Miguel González, who is consulting partner at Políticas Públicas de Asesoría Legislativa. And the name of their paper, their essay, is Balancing the Right of Property Owners and Energy Companies After Mexico's Energy Reform.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you all of you for being here. Let me begin by saying that I don't want to be optimistic, but certainly I do not share a certain kind of non-optimistic approach to this thing. Let's be honest, Mexico is the 13th economy of the world. We have going through a modernization process during the last 100 years, which has been remarkable and probably not equipable to any other country. That does not mean that we do not have problems, that we do not have corruption strongly and very deep inside of the society, but that hasn't really been so aggressive as to not let this country go on. And by that, I don't want to defend anyone. What I want to do is just to try to put things in its right perspective and to try to identify the real problems that this thing has. Karl Popper used to say that to wrong questions, there is no a nice or a good answer. And what we want to do is to ask the good question as to receive a good answer and not the other way around. Let me focus on my issue here. The energy reform is a very strong and very bold intention of modernization of the Mexican economy as a whole, not just in one sector. And that has created enormous problems, and a lot of groups against it, and a lot of groups trying to make this not happen. And I think that at the bottom of the thing, there is a real, let's say, fight for resources and to make this thing goes on or not. You have on the one side syndicates and unions and social groups and even radical leftists trying to fight at the ground level, and on the other hand, people that is very convinced that capitalism should take over that industry and that sector. And I think that quarrel, that fight, is going to express itself very, very strongly, and all the characteristics that we have heard all this day, they're going to express very hardly and very strongly at the ground level. At the ground level, that is to say, in the small communities, in the municipios, in the ejidos, in the communal lands, the things are going to get very rough in many ways. At least they will face, or companies that will invest there will face two problems, which are the follows. First, a very confusing and difficult to understand land property laws. And the other thing that is going to be very difficult to understand is what we call the claim industry. Let me get further on that. Of course, in Mexico there is private property, but it was given by the state. And in the 27th article of the Constitution, it says that the state can give any kind of rule or any kind of destination to that property. And in the other part, all the rest of the land that is not private property, it's communal, which means that everybody that lives there owns it. It's ejidal, which means that certain pieces of land were divided and were given to a family which has broken and broken and broken again. So today, the promedium or the average of every person has of a land is no more than 1 or 2 hectares. That is about 4 or 5 acres. And you have, again, other type of land like federal reserves, local reserves, municipal reserves of land, which the companies will have to deal with that. In the middle of that, there is this difficult thing to understand, mostly for Americans. The people that owns the field, the ground, the superficial land, is not owner of the underground land, which means that you can use the land above. But if someone comes and says, look, there is oil in your land, and because there is oil, there is a preeminence of the oil exploitation, we will have to use your surface land. That will generate a lot of problems. Because when collective actions get together, they have stopped. I have accounted at least 7 billion investment programs that have been canceled in electricity and in transportation of gas and in production of electricity and some other things. So that is going to be the first major problem. The second major problem is going to be the claim industry. What is the claim industry? During the 70s, when the oil exploded, the oil industry exploded in Mexico as to construct and to build and to rebuild or further the exploitation of oil and gas. The industry was made by Pemex, yes, but basically speaking with 3 kinds of people. The 3 groups of people, the first one was the military, the second were the engineers, and the third one was some guys with boxes or big bags with money that were paying without really arranging the problems of land and land occupation. That meant, finally, after many years, more than 10, that in front of the National Human Rights Commission, a quarrel was put, and all those lands had to be paid or arranged, or everybody has to react, or the government got together to pay and to rebuild what was destroyed. What happened is that many groups from the left, from the right, from all society, saw this as a big business. And in many places, if you see these major 7 projects that I have talked about, you will find not only the nice, beautiful people that defends the environment and so on, but also you will see very, very strong leftist, mostly leftist radical groups trying to get money out of the social claims. And that has become an industry. And that industry is expressed directly in the very small towns and land, in the ejidos, in the communal land, and in the how you call it, in the production sphere, in the most smallest production sphere of that use land and water. Actually, and I don't want to exaggerate by this, but my work has put me in connection with other companies that do advisory or try or discuss these things, and most of the companies that are trying to get into operations in the very small level are talking about direct extortion. They come, they try to put the office in a municipio, the municipal president comes and says, I'm very sorry, but I think I cannot let you operate. And the company asks why, and they say, because you haven't put some money to the local party, which is to the local celebration of the saint of whatever, you may invent whatever. And when they appear, I said, okay, I will participate in the celebration of your saint. How much is that? Why don't we put it in $1 million? And please put it in a bag and left it at that restaurant where a person is going to pick it up. This might seem a joke, but it's really preoccupying, because at that level there is no cooperation from local authorities. They don't care if we made a huge energy reform. They don't care if we are going to benefit as a country as a whole. They don't have any connection with that. So it is very advisable that any company that is going to be there should know that these kind of problems are going to be faced, and should take provisions about it. There are several professionals that are doing that work in Mexico already, and they are very good doing it. Let me tell you the extension, just to finish up, the extension of the problem. Ronda 0 and Ronda 1, which were the first offerings of land to be exploited all around the Gulf of Mexico, means in general terms, or it was calculated that it meant something like $50 billion of investment in the next 10 years or 15 years. That means 4,800,000 hectares, around 12 million acres, 146 municipalities in 10 states, and around 2,000 agrarian nucleus, which I'm going to quarrel, and I'm going to say many things when a pipeline tries to run through the land or are using the land for something else. Ronda 1, which is the second beating, it's around 72 municipalities in 7 states with around 700 agrarian nucleus, which are the very basic family or group of production in agriculture. And it will take around 1 million hectares, around 2 million acres. The rest you can imagine. There is no, as has been said here, already undergoing a huge or a great institutional force that can take care of this thing. The institution, as already has been said here, the institutions built to regulate and to work with this market are small, young, with rules which are not totally clear, and nonetheless, this is going. And this is going because the investment's already done in this thing, and the look of the market in the next years are so that it cannot be stopped. So, well, it's not a very optimistic thing, but I think we should think it over in very serious and weighted matters. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, we have now Pilar Rodriguez, who's going to share with us her essay regarding local governments in the energy sector and implications of the energy reform for local governments. Gracias, Pilar.
Gracias. Buenas tardes. Antes que nada, quisiera comentar que...
Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to say it's a great honor for me to be at this prestigious Baker Institute, at this great university, Rice University. I would like to apologize for having to speak to you in Spanish, and I will talk slowly for those of you who need translation. I also want to thank the Autonomous University of Nuevo León, the Technological Institute of Monterrey, University of Houston, the Mexico Center, and the 5 institutions that are participated in this project. I thank them for the invitation. And as Pablo, our moderator, said, I will give you some of my reflections on the role that local governments have in Mexico. In particular, I will focus on the northeastern Mexican states, Coahuila, Nuevo León, and Tamaulipas, as well as the implications of the reform for these governments. But first of all, I would like to give you some key data about these northeastern entities that I'm focusing on. These states have a very developed manufacturing sector with high energy industries, in energy-intensive industries like steel, cement, glass, chemical industries, etc. They work with non-conventional hydrocarbons in several entities. And Coahuila is the state with the largest coal reserves in Mexico. And in general, the northeastern provinces or northeastern states have a lot of renewable energy, mainly wind energy and sun energy. Burgos is the non-associated gas project that's the most important in the country. It represented last year 17% of the production of natural gas at the national level, and the states of Tamaulipas and Nuevo León have each a refinery, and they represent 25% of the national production of oil. Now, as was said this morning, Mexico is at the implementation phase of the energy reform, and local governments have a role to play in this implementation. However, they face significant challenges. Some of these challenges are the lack of urban infrastructure, energy infrastructure that's robust, that's safe, the need to actually leverage their human capital and to develop their technological capacity. As has been said also, they face possible impacts at the environmental level, at the social level, that might affect the development of energy projects in those territories. I would like to mention 3 implications of the reform for these governments that could actually help them in this path to implement the reform. The first one would be the implementation of a new tax as established by the law of income from the hydrocarbon industry. This is a way to decentralize the resources of the Federation and to send those resources to the producing municipalities as a way of compensation. Article 54 on the law of income from hydrocarbons says that contractors have to pay that tax as a percentage of each of the square area. And the beginning will be 1,500 pesos in the exploration phase per square kilometer, 6,000 pesos per square kilometer during the production phase. These resources will be sent to a fund to develop these entities, these municipalities that are developing these hydrocarbons. It will be destined in municipalities to investments in infrastructure to remediate the effects on the environment and on society. For example, urban transportation, maintenance of local roads, lighting, civil protection works, and the reconstruction of infrastructure affected by natural disasters, amongst others. The northeast of the country, where I have focused my study, will benefit from the collection of this tax. During the second round of bids, 7 of the fields that were granted are located in those states, Nuevo León and Tamaulipas. There is also an ambitious package of infrastructure projects contained in the National Infrastructure Project for 2014-2015. These projects will contribute to the creation of employment and the economic development of the northeastern states. For example, one of the main investment projects in the exploration and production activities is called Burgos. This project focuses specifically on the northeastern states and on an exploration plan that has as a goal to increase the production of gas. The investment from both the private and public sector will be over 50 billion pesos during this period, 2015-2018. Another implication of the reform for these local governments will be the obligation on the part of the companies to perform evaluations of social impact for these energy projects in the hydrocarbon and power generation industries. In accordance with the Energy Secretary, the objective of these evaluations is for energy projects to have better acceptance from society, to minimize also the issue of cancellation of services or outages. There is some general regulations that have been issued for these evaluations. This has been in discussion since March of 2015 at the Commission for the Improvement of Regulatory Measures. I would like to emphasize that the cooperation and collaboration that might exist amongst companies and governments, local and state governments, is very important. The communication with the communities and the governments, of course, are understood to be closest to the needs of the populations, communities in the areas affected by energy projects. And for those governments, it is critical that the evaluations of social impact be carried out following the best practices to reduce the risk of social conflicts and to avoid affecting the quality of life of these communities. Now, based on this discussion on the implication of the reform, there's a doubt that emerges. What could be the role of these governments in the new energy sector? And the answer from my study is that, first of all, this role has to respect the rule of law and has to be in accordance with the duties of the local governments. The local governments, first of all, have to be very familiar with the new law. This could be a proactive role, a role of cooperation with all the civil society and the public and private sector, with a long-term vision of the energy future, since these states of the Northeast share some energy resources and are part of the same scheme of regional development. What we have seen so far from these 3 states are some individual reactions. Nuevo León and Tamaulipas have already publicized their state energy plans. In 2014, Coahuila created a cluster of the mining and oil industry. Tamaulipas is part of a cluster of that region in the south of Mexico. And Nuevo León has created an energy commission at the state level. So that they can jointly define actions to attract capital, to attract investment in the energy sector, allowing the Northeast to become a development pole for energy in the country. They have proposed the creation of a regional energy council where all the strategic partners are represented, the local governments, the municipalities, and also the federal government, the companies, the higher education institutions, and civil society. This regional energy council could be a space that allows the cooperation between all the strategic actors to share information, best practices, to visualize opportunities for business and to attract investments, and also to identify the shared problems, shared issues that can emerge from the implementation of the reform, and to adjust the planning in order to promote the regional energy development. And this council could be a forum trying to balance that relation of cooperation, coordination between the federal government and the local governments in the northeast of the country, so that the latter can be taken into account in the energy policy decisions of the federal government when they are affected, and where they can have a guarantee of compensation, because at the end of the day, energy projects have a local character. So these are my comments, and open to questions from the audience. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to all of you. And so far, we have all heard in this panel quite interesting topics regarding the challenges at the local level. Lupita stressed the importance of three fundamental challenges: the impact of violence, corruption, and social conflicts. Pilar just shared with us some ideas about the regional council in order to face some of the fundamental challenges at the local level, in order to strengthen the capabilities of them. And Miguel clearly exemplified those challenges with some examples. However, I wouldn't like to leave this panel or to end the day with a negative or pessimistic mood. So I would like to ask you, I know you all have some recommendations to start facing these challenges. So I would like you to share with us some of your recommendations in order to avoid negative impacts of such challenges.
Yes, my comment about my not very optimistic or maybe pessimistic thinking about the situation in Mexico does not mean that that I don't see a future. Of course, and I do believe that the solution must be really strong, and we need to be. I mean, we need to have a very strong commitment with the rule of law. And I think that it might sound a little bit, strong in the sense that I'm saying that punishment is very important. It seemed to me that it's good to talk about trust, transparency, but if we think it in a negative way, we might get to a better solution. Several people are raising the possibility of probably changing some of the rules of the game to improve this way of making justice. And I'm talking about the possibility of probably having an impeachment, the possibility of, for example, the CICIG in Guatemala gave us an important example of how to do things in a better way, even if the solution is strong. At this point, with scandals like La Casa Blanca, the involvement of governors in high-level crimes, including, for example, their responsibility in disappearances, like the violation of human rights is tremendous in Mexico. Transparency International, Transparency International, Mexican Transparency, the chapter of Mexico, Amnesty International, the World Justice Project is putting Mexico in very low levels according to this measurement. So we really need to implement implement, and we really need to punish people for doing not right things. I think we have to start from that.
Thank you, Lupita. Miguel.
I'm sorry if I left. I didn't want to give or to put a gloomy perspective.
No, that's real, I guess. Unfortunately, but let's discuss some ideas how to solve them.
But let me tell you something. There are several things to do. Actually, there are several things to do. The first of them is, I was surprised by what Pilar has read to us. That should be strengthened and should be further put forward. If municipalities and states have incentives to follow and cooperate with the reform, another thing will happen. Right. I mean, at the ground level, another thing will happen, and and I think that is very, very important. The other thing is that if you take the experience of Brazil or Canada, in terms of how they develop the industry, you might get some ideas. Actually, it's not the federal government which gives the authorization or the permits or the deals to the oil and the gas industry, but rather the states and the provinces. And that makes the local governments get involved in a more, more hygiene way. It leaves for every region and for every city a specific responsibility to deal with the matters that have to do with the permits, with the operation, with the use of water, with all the environmental things. And I think that is something that should be look upon and try to find a solution around that possibility. Now, the bad thing is that instead of having a federal policy around the energy sector, you will have as many policies as states and involved, and that's something that should be thought about it. Someone very rightly said along the day that the real question is if we want an energy market or an energy industry or not, and if we are ready to cross through that idea and to make it happen really. If we want to make it really happen, we have to have priorities. And I'm sorry, I know you shouldn't say this in a university and less in front of these people and less in this table, but if we want an industry, the communities are going to suffer, and we have to give them another alternative. I'd rather have, if we want to make a market, we have to have infrastructure, pipelines, regardless of anything else. There's a huge project, just to advance this idea. There's a huge project which can generate huge amounts of megawatts. I mean, it's enormous. And in the Istmo de Tehuantepec. And there is a very leftist and famous radical, even guerrilla movement at some point called COSEI. And it's exactly there. And the project means something like $1.5 billion of investment. It could generate, I don't know how many thousand possibilities of work in a zone which is very poor and has no real alternatives in terms of agriculture. But tradition is very, very deep grounded in this place. And so when the aeolic industry came and said, well, we rent your land. For what? Not to put some things that make rounds like this, and don't worry, you will not suffer at all. When COSEI heard this thing, they put themselves in this claim industry scenario, and they have stopped the project for the last 3 years. And the local authorities doesn't want to get involved. The state authorities doesn't want to get involved. The federal government doesn't want to go against the governor, which is trying to solve the political problem. And $1.5 billion of investment, and I don't know how many thousand works are not taking place. And actually, instead of bringing those poor to a better situation, you are, because cultural things or a vision of how things must be addressed, you are not letting the industry grow. So I think, again, what is the compromise? What are we willing to do to make this as a top priority or not? And I think all what we have said today shows a lot of priorities that have to be taken into account as to make this industry work in the context of this modernization project, which actually is the energy reform, probably one of the hugest, most important modernization projects in Mexico during the last 30, 40 years.
Thank you, Miguel, very much. Pilar?
Bueno, como
Well,
comenté
as I mentioned earlier, my participation, we have the proposal for the specific case of the northeast of the country, this creation of these energy councils, regional councils. But after this experience, I mean, this experience could be replicated in other areas of the country. I believe it's really important. On the one hand, we do not want to lose sight of the participation of the communities. On the other hand, we have to understand that Mexico is a huge country, and the communities are different throughout the country. It is not exactly the same. You have communities in the south that are different from the communities in the northern areas of the country. And also, in the northern area of the country, the communities vary from state to state. Each area is different. That's why it's very important, especially to establish trust. Trust from the people, trust in the development of these projects. And from my point of view, the participation of the municipal authorities and the local authorities, and those are the people that are the closest to their communities. And that's very important to build those bridges and open up those channels of communication and channels of trust. And it's also important to know what the opinion of the industry is. And that's why all these administrative clauses, what we were talking about, the studies on social impact and so on, it's really important. And you have to talk to the Commission of Regulatory Reform. I think it's been enough time. It's now. We need to know what the industry thinks about it, and it's very important that the government offers certainty to the companies. They need to tell them what they expect to hear from these evaluations of social impact. There's another issue here, the capacity that the Secretary of Energy is going to have through the social impact department. They will have to read all these evaluations of social impact. They will have to appraise these reports, and they will have to appraise what the social impact will actually be. So we want this, we want the companies to propose a social plan so that you can mitigate the social impact of the project. So to what extent companies then are going to say, well, a social investment plan, I'm already making a huge investment in an energy project. So what is it that the government expects from us? Or do you expect from us as a company for us to invest in something that is really your job, the government's responsibility? So that should be part of the discussion too. And this is something that I want to just open up the floor so that we can possibly have a discussion on this
well,
too.
It seems to me that all the answers to some extent have something to do with citizen participation and more transparency. Because on the other side of the coin, it's also true that most of the local governments, some of them, they don't have even clue what can or can't do regarding the energy reform or some of the impacts. So, yes, we're going to open the mic to questions here. Mara, and then we have here the other one.
Thank you very much. I appreciate very much your comments. I think the issues are there. I think there's a lot of agreement among the panelists about kind of what the core challenges are, it seems, and but quite differences in perspectives, I think, about how to approach them. I find very kind of really three very different paradigms. One that goes at kind of the very structural, political level of, are we really serious about fighting impunity? And if so, that should include the president himself. From the more, local perspective, trying to include the communities. And what I find maybe in Miguel's presentation, thinking of more in terms of, well, there's going to be collateral damages maybe at the local level. And I just want to say that that it does worry me, because this idea of, thinking about the impact of communities as collateral damages, I think it's dangerous. I mean, we do have a crisis of violence already, and and when you ask the question, are we serious about wanting an energy market, who are you asking it to? I mean, it sounds as if you're speaking, we are owners of the country, like here us, this very small elite. What do we want for the country? And that's the point I was trying to raise in my presentation about the legitimacy of this reform. It has deficits of legitimacy because it's a small Toby group, deciding what's the model for the country, an elite of technocrats. And I think it is really a recipe for deepening the crisis of democracy. So thank you.
Here you have Steve over there. Oh, sorry. You already have the mic over there.
Okay. Hugo Espinosa with Baker Hughes. Okay, during the discussion or recommendations that you made regarding the issues and subjects that have been discussed, I got the sense that the recommendations of what needed to be done was to address the root cause, which is on the claim industry, obviously, society and the government and government organizations. But what would be the specific recommendations to an investor on the oil and gas exploration and production, i.e. an operator coming into the country that's never operated in Mexico or worked in Mexico, to address those issues? I mean, the investor is not going to be able to fix the social corruption or claim industry. So how do they address? How do they organize, or what kind of structure do they need and actions they need to take to address that situation in a compliant manner?
Well, many people have perceived this, and actually, at least I know 3 or 4 firms that are already giving advice to companies into this respect. Government is, to a certain degree, ready to receive and to talk with investors and to try to find solutions. But in our experience, in our firm, we have dealt for the last 3 years with the problem with Celanese and the community, actually with one person of the community. And our experience hasn't been very optimistic. And it hasn't been because this guy is the cacique of the town and he has pushed by trying to sell land. I mean, the classic problem between a company that has 50 years already there and suddenly the cacique decided that it's about time to get paid. Why? Because you are rich and I'm not. So it is going to be a problem. I think counseling is going to be needed, at least at the beginning, but not only for the companies, also for the government. The government doesn't really know up to now how to arrange certain things because it's complex. And let me tell you something about it, by the way. It has been said here that companies like BP or some others work in very difficult situations and they have to, even to have armed people around the facilities, so on. What they say is that, yes, they are in Afghanistan with armed people, but they know that if they call the guy which is in the red suit, he's going to fix the problem. And they know that if they do this and that, the thing is going to work. The problem is that the reform in Mexico is so new and the implementation is so in its way that they don't know who is the guy that pulls the strings and who is the guy who solves the things. So it's going to be an ongoing process of coming from a huge reform which I tend to disagree, is not going to be the first time with Mara. We have years of disagreeing, but the legitimacy of the thing is that the Congress, which represents the Mexicans, took the reform, and then the government has to deal with the second legislature, and then et cetera, up to the ground level. And in the ground level is where nobody knows really what to do. It's going to be an experience that we have to go hand in hand, government, private enterprise, consulting, etc., and to resolve it, because there is no clear thing right now.
Sorry, Lupita, and then Pilar, go ahead.
I wouldn't disagree completely with what Mara said, because something that's not legitimate, or people don't consider it as they're a part of it, it's never gonna work. So it's very important, and that leads me to try to answer this question. This is not a zero-sum game just for the companies, right? I think if the companies that arrive to Mexico, they need to bring growth to the community, and they need to understand the cultural difference between their countries where they are where they are from and where they are being operating in other parts of the world. The complexities of our communities, of our peoples in different parts of the country. Our country is not monolithic. It's very complex. But if you go to Oaxaca, you need to. I mean, this is one of the most complicated states in the country. 1/4 of the number of municipalities of the whole country is in just this one. Yes, but 1/4 of the total number. That's right. So I think that this has been decided. We cannot do anything about it. How legitimate or not it is, it's probably, we have to legitimize in the practice. So, investors need to come and generate growth and understand. We don't have any other choice. The reform was passed as it is. It cannot be changed, so I think we all have to compromise, and we all have to try to find a good way of working together for this.
Thank you, Lupita. Pilar.
Con relación a su pregunta, ¿qué pueden hacer los inversores?
In reference to your question of what can investors do, who can they approach if they have doubts, I think academia, the higher learning institutions in Mexico, we have a very large and significant responsibility, precisely because we are actors who can, at any given time, generate more respect, more trust. We're more trustworthy on these issues. For example, at the Autonomous University, we have had people from the state of Chihuahua approach us. They don't have any idea at the government level on how to implement the reform. So I think there's some serious, significant work that's being done at universities trying to understand the new legislation, to provide support with these issues. We have people who are very capable, who can analyze the social impact, the environmental impact assessments that will be carried out. We will be providing recommendations, and I think that the universities can have an important role on this, mainly because of this climate, this environment of lack of trust that exists.
Fellows armed with the mic, Stephen and Alex.
Una batalla. Miguel.
Yes.
Am I correct in thinking there are two different kinds of issues that might arise? One has to do with property owners and what compensation will they get from companies, and the other has to do with the community. The latter is a much more difficult problem, let's say. But the former one, am I correct in understanding that the new energy reform laws include procedures about to deal with is that what you're talking about with the claims industry?
They do.
Yeah. And could you speak just very briefly to the complexities of that? Because when we spoke about it before, you said something like there are 6 different agencies. I don't know if they're mentioned in the law or if it's just naturally are going to be involved, that there is a complexity. I thought it was a brilliant point that Eduardo Perez Mota made about if you want to have regulation, have a strong regulator that has just one thing to do. But in this case, you have negotiations with property owners and you have a bunch of different agencies. Could you just briefly discuss that?
Thank you, Stephen. You have, sorry, Secretary of Energy, the Commission Regulatory of Energy, the Commission for the indigenous people, for the indigenous, the Commission, the Gobernación, if that touches things of governability. You have well, of course, the Commission of Competence, which if there is a problem around that. And then you have, not in all the states are, but in some states you have ecological commissions, you have, so at least you might have around 7 to 8 different authorities involved in the thing. Secondly, there's a problem of procedures. The procedures have 3 or 4 basic points. You have to confront the community with honest and clear information. There's no definition of honest and clear information, but let's assume you go with your best interest and talk to them. You should take into account the provisions of the 109 article of the pardon? ILO. Sí, yes, the ILO. And that it says that you should be flexible and to try to talk to all the indigenous people that is there, or the indígenas which are there. Now, what is an indígena? Do you have a proof of blood of who is indígena or not? And then you cross that with the Amparo thing, and if you consult all the community, but you have one person that claims to be an indígena and he wasn't consulted, then he can get an Amparo and stop the whole investment and the procedure that is there. On the other hand, after 3 months, because this is a very important industry and we want to build an industry, because it's priority, then the government gets in and try to fix the parts which are in conflict and to put the pipelines or whatever you have there. However, if the community is sufficiently strong and well organized, it can stop a project. Actually, in Morelos, there is a huge project which needs to use the water from the Rio Cuautla, and it has, I think, 170 meters of pipeline of water which hasn't been put into the facility because the community doesn't want it, and they have had very difficult problems, and like 200 meters of pipeline of gas to make the double cycle and to generate electricity. And the project is around $1.8 billion, and it's stopped for the last 3 years. So, institutions, community problems, I think we have observed that, and we have a legislation which is not in the procedure, and the definition of the people involved is not very clear who should get involved and who doesn't. Actually, for gas, you need to pay, if a pipeline crosses your land, you have to pay certain amount between 0.5 to 2.5 of the general thing. Now, the ejido, let me tell you, the ejido, it's a piece of land which is divided into pieces of smaller land. Sorry, this pen must be from the energy reform because it doesn't write. Well, you have this is an ejido. Let's say, hope everybody can see, and let's say the pipeline crosses here. That means 1, 2, 3 lands. Now the ejido is decided everything all together. So everybody would like to have something from the fact that the pipeline is crossing these 3 pieces of land of the whole ejido, because that's the customs of the way they work. So it's not clear to who you pay. You pay only, the law doesn't say you pay only the 3 where your pipeline is going. Either said you pay the whole ejido, and so on. So it's just an example of how the complexity of this experiment is going to go. And as Lupita has said, we need to broaden, we need to construct the legitimacy of this. As in that, I'm very in the line of Mara. We need to construct the legitimacy of this in a day-to-day basis because it's there. There's no way back, and we need to work in it.
Well, we tried in this conversation today to look at the intersection of 2 things. One, energy reform, which looks relatively simple, top-down, from space, looking in. And, of course, when you get on the ground, you get all the social, cultural, legal, and political complexities that are likely to hit every single project. And if we don't have the political legitimacy, if we do not have the buy-in of the community, these are going to be very complex projects. The large companies will be able to deal with it. The smaller companies are going to have a very, very tough time. And of course, the lawyers will have a lot of work. Thank you very much for accompanying us today. It's been wonderful to have you. Thank you.